Hello, my dear friends. Tonight we begin a quiet journey into the lives of women in old Japan, focusing on pregnancy not as a medical event, but as a historical experience shaped by rules, belief, and endurance. This is not a story of modern hospitals or scientific understanding. It is a story of survival within tradition, in a world where pain was expected, silence was respected, and strength was shown without words. In ancient and early pre-modern Japan, pregnancy was understood as a natural but dangerous state. Women did not speak of it openly. It was not celebrated loudly, nor discussed casually. Instead, pregnancy existed in a careful space between hope and fear. High maternal mortality meant that survival was never guaranteed. Because of this, society developed rules meant to protect both mother and child, even if those rules often increased emotional isolation. Pregnancy in old Japan was governed by belief rather than biology. Without modern anatomy or medicine, people explained pregnancy through balance, spirits, and fate. A woman's body was believed to be especially vulnerable during this time. Not weak, but open. Open to harm, misfortune, and unseen forces. This belief shaped strict behavioral rules. One of the most important rules was silence. Women were encouraged not to announce pregnancy early. Speaking too soon was believed to attract bad luck or harmful spirits. Many women hid their condition for months, continuing daily work while carefully adjusting movement and posture. This silence was not secrecy for shame, but protection through restraint. Another rule concerned movement. Pregnant women were advised to avoid long journeys, uneven ground, and places associated with death or impurity. Cemeteries, battle sites, and certain temples were avoided. These rules reflected the belief that life and death should not cross paths. Pregnancy was life in formation and it needed distance from decay. Work did not stop entirely. In farming villages, women continued labor as long as their bodies allowed. However, tasks were adjusted. Heavy lifting, prolonged bending, and cold exposure were discouraged when possible. This was not compassion in the modern sense, but recognition of risk. The body was expected to endure, but not to be tested unnecessarily. Dietary rules were strict and symbolic. Certain foods were encouraged for strength and balance, while others were avoided for fear they might harm the unborn child. These food rules were based on tradition and observation rather than nutrition science. Warm foods were favored, cold foods were limited. Balance mattered more than abundance. Pain was expected, not treated. Pregnancy discomfort was considered part of womanhood. Complaining openly was discouraged. Endurance was praised quietly. Strength was shown through continuation of daily life rather than expression of suffering. This expectation shaped how women experienced pregnancy internally, often without shared support beyond other women. Support came primarily from women. Elder women, mothers, and midwives carried knowledge passed through generations. This knowledge was practical, ritualistic, and deeply respected. Men were largely absent from pregnancy matters. Childbearing belonged to the female world, protected by distance and silence. From a historical perspective, pregnancy in old Japan was not surrounded by comfort, but by structure. Rules existed to reduce risk in a world without control. Pain was accepted because it was unavoidable. Survival depended on obedience to tradition rather than intervention. As this first part settles into quiet reflection, imagine a rural Japanese home centuries ago. A woman moves carefully, says little, and follows rules she did not create but deeply trusts. Her body carries life forward through endurance rather than reassurance. This is where the story begins. In old Japan, when a woman became pregnant, protection was sought not through medicine but through ritual. These rituals were not dramatic or public. They were quiet, repeated, and deeply woven into daily life. Pregnancy was believed to place a woman between worlds, carrying new life while remaining close to danger. Rituals existed to guide her safely through this uncertain space. One of the earliest and most important rituals occurred around the 5th month of pregnancy. This moment was chosen because many pregnancies that survived this long were believed to have a stronger chance of continuing. At this stage, women often participated in a ceremony involving a special maternity sash known as an obi. This cloth was wrapped carefully around the belly, offering physical support and symbolic protection. The act was slow and deliberate, often guided by older women who had experienced childbirth themselves. The sash was not simply clothing, it represented containment and balance. It was believed to keep the unborn child properly positioned and to protect the mother from spiritual harm. The wrapping of the obi was accompanied by quiet prayers rather than celebration. Joy was restrained. Respect for uncertainty guided every movement. Shrines played a central role in pregnancy protection. Women or their female relatives visited Shinto shrines dedicated to safe childbirth. These visits were calm and respectful. Offerings were simple. Rice, cloth, or small coins were presented. Prayers asked not for ease but for survival. Pain was accepted as part of the process. The wish was not to avoid it, but to endure it safely. Amulets were another important form of protection. These small objects were carried discreetly, hidden within clothing or placed near the body. They were believed to guard against misfortune and unseen harm. The power of these amulets came from belief and continuity. Generations had trusted them. That trust itself provided comfort. Pregnancy rituals also included avoidance. Certain words were not spoken. Certain actions were delayed. Women avoided sudden movements, loud emotional displays, and confrontations. Calmness was believed to protect the unborn child. Emotional balance was considered as important as physical care. Buddhist influence added another layer to these practices. In some regions, women prayed to bodhisattvas associated with mercy and protection. These prayers were quiet and repetitive. Repetition mattered. It created rhythm and steadiness in a time of uncertainty. Faith did not remove danger, but it gave structure to fear. Community involvement remained limited. Pregnancy was not widely discussed. Rituals were personal and family-based. This privacy reduced outside attention, which was believed to reduce risk. Silence itself became a form of protection. From a historical perspective, these rituals were not superstition alone. They were systems of emotional management in a world without medical certainty. They gave women a sense of control, continuity, and support when outcomes were unpredictable. As this part continues quietly, imagine a woman kneeling in a small shrine, hands folded, breath steady. No one rushes her. No one promises safety. The ritual does not remove pain, but it prepares her to endure it. This quiet preparation shaped survival. Daily life for a pregnant woman in old Japan changed quietly rather than dramatically. There was no clear moment when work stopped or rest fully began. Instead, pregnancy was absorbed into routine, adjusted gently through habit and observation. Survival depended on endurance guided by restraint, not on protection through isolation. In rural villages, most women continued their daily labor for as long as their bodies allowed. Farming, food preparation, water carrying, and household work did not disappear with pregnancy. However, there was an unspoken understanding among women about limits. Tasks were redistributed subtly. Heavier work was avoided when possible. This adjustment was not announced or formalized. It happened through observation and shared experience, rather than instruction. Rest existed, but it was quiet and conditional. Pregnant women rested when pain or fatigue made work impossible, not because rest was prescribed. Sitting, kneeling, or lying down happened between tasks rather than replacing them. Long periods of inactivity were discouraged, as movement was believed to maintain balance in the body. Stillness was associated with stagnation, which was feared. Silence shaped daily life strongly. Pregnancy was not discussed openly, even among family members. Women rarely complained. Pain was expected and internalized. Expressing discomfort openly could be seen as attracting misfortune or weakening emotional balance. Endurance was valued not as heroism, but as normal womanhood. Clothing supported this endurance. Loose garments and the maternity sash helped stabilize the body during movement. These physical supports reduced strain during work and walking. Comfort was practical, not luxurious. Clothing adjusted to the body's needs without drawing attention. Eating followed established routines. Meals were simple and regular. Overeating was discouraged, as excess was believed to burden the body and complicate birth. Hunger and moderation existed side by side. Balance mattered more than abundance. Sleep patterns also changed. Pregnant women often slept lightly, waking early and resting when possible during the day. Sleep was not uninterrupted or deeply restorative. Discomfort was accepted. Nighttime rest was part of survival, not recovery. Emotional restraint remained central. Strong emotions were believed to affect the unborn child. Anger, fear, and grief were avoided when possible. This did not mean women felt less emotion. It meant emotion was managed internally. Calmness was cultivated through repetition and routine rather than reassurance. Support came from proximity rather than conversation. Other women watched closely. Help was offered without explanation. Advice was rarely spoken directly. Knowledge passed through example rather than instruction. This quiet network of support formed the core of pregnancy survival. From a historical perspective, daily life during pregnancy in old Japan reveals a system built on adaptation rather than protection. Women were not removed from life. They remained within it, adjusting pace and movement while carrying both pain and responsibility. As this part settles into calm continuation, imagine a woman working slowly in a field, stopping briefly, then continuing. No one speaks of her condition. Everyone knows. Life moves forward with her, steady and silent. In old Japan, the most important figures in pregnancy and childbirth were not doctors or officials, but women who carried knowledge through experience. Midwives, known historically as sanba, and elder women formed the quiet foundation of survival. Their authority did not come from written texts or formal training. It came from repetition, memory, and trust built over generations. The sanba was not always a full-time professional. In many communities, she was an older woman who had assisted in many births. Her knowledge was practical and situational. She understood how bodies moved, how pain unfolded, and how fear could interfere with birth. She did not promise safety. She prepared women to endure. Midwives were called late in pregnancy, often only when labor approached. Before that, their presence remained distant. This distance reflected belief. Too much attention was thought to invite misfortune. The Sanba entered the process quietly, without announcement, and without ceremony. During pregnancy, elder women observed rather than instructed. Advice was indirect. Warnings were given through stories or reminders of past outcomes rather than commands. This approach respected both tradition and uncertainty. No one claimed full knowledge. Survival depended on humility before what could not be controlled. When labor began, the space was prepared carefully. Childbirth usually took place at home, often in a separate area arranged to reduce disturbance. Men were typically excluded. Birth belonged to the female world. This separation was not shameful. It was protective. Silence and focus were believed to reduce danger. The Sanba guided posture, breathing, and timing through calm instruction. Pain relief was minimal. There were no anesthetics. Touch, reassurance, and positioning were the primary tools. Women were encouraged to remain upright or kneeling, positions believed to aid delivery. These choices came from observation rather than theory. Elder women supported the mother through presence rather than words. Their role was to steady the environment. Fear was managed through calm repetition. Panic was believed to endanger both mother and child. Strength was measured by endurance, not by absence of pain. After birth, care continued quietly. The Sanba remained to ensure bleeding slowed and the mother regained basic strength. The newborn was cleaned and wrapped. The mother rested briefly, then slowly returned to routine. Recovery was not a separate stage. It blended into life. Knowledge passed from woman to woman without formal record. Each birth added to collective understanding. Failures were remembered as warnings. Successes became patterns. This memory-based system adapted slowly, shaped by loss as much as survival. From a historical perspective, midwives and elder women formed an informal but powerful medical system. It lacked technology, but it carried continuity. Their authority endured because it worked often enough to be trusted. As this part continues quietly, imagine a dimly lit room, women gathered in stillness. A midwife speaks softly. Breath follows rhythm. Pain moves forward, guided by hands that have seen it before. Survival rests not on certainty, but on shared experience. When labor began in old Japan, it did not announce itself loudly. There were no alarms, no rushed journeys, and no public urgency. Labor entered the household quietly, as something expected, yet never fully predictable. Women recognized the signs through sensation rather than instruction. Pain did not mean panic. It meant arrival. Childbirth was understood as a natural but dangerous passage. Survival depended on calm more than speed. Fear was believed to disturb the body's balance and interfere with delivery. For this reason, emotional control was considered as important as physical positioning. The environment was prepared to reduce noise, movement, and outside attention. The birthing space was simple. It was often a room within the home, sometimes separated by screens. Light was low. Warmth was maintained. Clean cloths and water were prepared in advance. These preparations followed tradition rather than sanitation science. Order and familiarity mattered more than sterility. Women rarely gave birth lying down. Upright positions were common. Kneeling, squatting, or sitting while supported were believed to allow gravity to assist the body. These positions were passed down through observation rather than written instruction. The body was trusted to move as it needed, guided gently by experienced hands. Pain was constant and expected. There were no anesthetics and no strong pain relief. Herbal infusions were sometimes used for comfort, but they did not remove pain. Pain was interpreted as progress. A woman was not encouraged to escape it, but to move through it steadily. Endurance was praised quietly, not dramatically. The midwife, or sanba, guided breathing and posture with calm repetition. Her voice was low and steady. She did not rush the process. Rushing was believed to cause harm. Time during labor was measured by the body, not the clock. Waiting was an act of trust. Other women present remained mostly silent. Their role was to maintain calm and support. Panic was avoided. Loud crying or emotional display was discouraged, not because pain was denied, but because control was believed to protect life. Strength was defined by restraint. Bleeding was closely watched. Excessive blood loss was one of the greatest dangers of childbirth. Without medical intervention, midwives relied on observation, pressure, warmth, and rest to reduce risk. Knowledge of danger signs came from experience rather than theory. The moment of birth was not celebrated immediately. Attention remained on the mother's survival. The newborn was important, but the mother's condition determined the outcome of the entire event. Only once bleeding slowed and breathing steadied did relief enter the room. The newborn was cleaned gently and wrapped. Ritual purity mattered. Birth was considered both sacred and polluting. This belief did not carry judgment. It reflected the idea that crossing into life involved contact with powerful forces that required careful handling. After delivery, the mother rested briefly, but not for long periods. Extended immobility was discouraged. Gentle movement returned gradually. The body was expected to recover through balance rather than rest alone. Pain continued after birth and was accepted as part of survival. There were no formal post-birth celebrations at first. Naming and acknowledgement came later. Early days focused on endurance. Complications could arise suddenly. Survival remained uncertain even after delivery. From a historical perspective, childbirth in old Japan was a test of patience rather than intervention. It relied on collective memory, calm environment, and bodily trust. Many women survived, many did not. The system persisted because it was the only one available, refined slowly through generations of experience. As this very long part settles into quiet continuation, imagine the room after birth. Breath slows. Pain fades into exhaustion. No one speaks loudly. Survival has occurred, but certainty has not yet arrived. Life pauses, steady and fragile. After childbirth in old Japan, survival did not immediately mean safety. The period following birth was considered one of the most dangerous times for a woman. Pain had passed, but risk remained. Because of this, strict post-birth rules governed recovery, behavior, and daily life. These rules were shaped by belief, experience, and fear of sudden loss. One of the strongest beliefs surrounding childbirth was impurity. Birth was seen as a powerful crossing between life and death. This did not imply shame, it meant danger. Because of this belief, mothers often entered a period of separation after delivery. This separation protected both the woman and the community from harm, believed to come from imbalance. During this time, the mother stayed mostly indoors. Movement outside the home was limited. Visitors were restricted. Silence and stillness returned. This isolation reduced physical strain and also reduced exposure to illness or emotional disturbance. It was not framed as care but as necessary restraint. The body was kept warm at all times. Cold was feared deeply. Exposure to cold air or water was believed to weaken the body and invite sickness. Warm clothing, blankets, and fires were used even in warmer seasons. Bathing was delayed. Cleanliness focused on wiping and changing cloths rather than immersion in water. Food rules became even stricter. Warm, simple meals were favored. Rice, soups, and easily digested foods were common. Heavy or cold foods were avoided. Eating was controlled carefully to rebuild strength without shocking the body. Overeating was discouraged. Balance remained the guiding principle. Breastfeeding began early and was considered essential. It was not only nourishment but a sign that the mother's body was functioning properly. Difficulty in breastfeeding caused concern, as it was believed to reflect imbalance or weakness. Elder women assisted quietly, offering guidance through demonstration rather than explanation. Pain after childbirth was expected. Bleeding, weakness, and soreness were accepted as part of recovery. Complaining was discouraged. Endurance continued to define strength. However, signs of severe bleeding or fever caused alarm. Midwives or elder women monitored these signs closely, knowing from experience how quickly danger could return. Spiritual protection remained important. Amulets stayed close to the body. Prayers continued quietly. The period after birth was considered vulnerable to spirits and misfortune. Protection focused on patience rather than celebration. Only after days or weeks did normal life slowly resume. The mother returned gradually to household duties. There was no clear marker of recovery. Survival was confirmed slowly through continued breathing, strength, and routine. From a historical perspective, post-birth rules in old Japan aimed to stabilize a fragile moment. Without medicine, restraint and ritual created space for healing. These practices were not gentle by modern standards, but they reflected careful observation of risk. As this part settles into calm continuation, imagine a quiet house after birth. The mother rests, wrapped in warmth. The child lies close. Outside, life waits. Inside, survival continues one day at a time. Maternal death was a known and deeply feared reality in old Japan. It was not rare and it was not unexpected. Communities lived with the knowledge that pregnancy and childbirth could end a woman's life without warning. Because of this, loss was woven quietly into the cultural understanding of birth. Hope existed, but it was cautious. Survival was never assumed. Women entered pregnancy knowing the risk, even if it was not spoken aloud. Stories of mothers who did not survive were remembered carefully, often without detail. These memories were not shared to frighten, but to teach restraint and humility before fate. Death was treated as part of life's rhythm, not as failure. When a woman died during or after childbirth, the response was restrained and ritualized. Loud grief was uncommon. Mourning followed established forms. Excessive emotion was believed to disturb both the living and the dead. Calm was maintained to protect the newborn and the household. Survival of the child became the immediate concern. Spiritual explanation surrounded maternal death. It was often understood through concepts of destiny, imbalance, or spiritual interference rather than medical cause. This understanding did not reduce pain, but it provided meaning in a world without answers. Meaning helped families endure what could not be changed. Special rituals addressed the fear that the spirit of a woman who died in childbirth might linger. These rituals were protective rather than accusatory. They aimed to calm the spirit and prevent further harm. This belief reflected respect for the power of motherhood, even in death. Children born under these circumstances were cared for communally. Other women stepped in quietly. Breastfeeding could be shared. Care responsibilities shifted without formal discussion. Community survival depended on adaptability. The loss of a mother was tragic, but life continued through collective effort. Maternal death reinforced obedience to pregnancy rules. Each loss strengthened belief in restraint, silence, and ritual. Rules became more than tradition. They became safeguards shaped by grief. Over time, these safeguards hardened into expectation. From a historical perspective, the acceptance of maternal death does not indicate indifference. It reflects endurance in the face of limited control. People learned to live with risk rather than deny it. Survival was valued precisely because it was uncertain. As this part continues quietly, imagine a village at dusk. A house remains silent after birth. No announcements are made. Life adjusts. Memory settles. Survival and loss exist side by side, accepted without question. Pregnancy in old Japan did not unfold in the same way for all women. Class shaped experience deeply. While danger and pain were shared realities, the rules, expectations, and forms of support differed between samurai households, peasant villages, and courtly elites. These differences reveal how survival was influenced not only by belief, but by position within society. For peasant women, pregnancy was closely tied to labor. Farming households depended on every working body. A pregnant woman continued field work, food preparation, and household tasks for as long as she could stand. There were few alternatives. Survival depended on endurance. Rules existed, but they bent under necessity. Rest was brief. Support came from other women only when absolutely required. Pain was accepted as part of duty to family and land. In contrast, samurai women experienced pregnancy within a more controlled environment. Their bodies were linked to lineage and honor. Producing heirs was a responsibility tied to family survival and status. Because of this, pregnancy was monitored more carefully. Work demands were reduced earlier. Movement was more restricted. Rituals were followed more strictly. Silence remained, but attention increased. Samurai households emphasized calm and order. Emotional restraint was especially important. Fear or disorder during pregnancy was believed to reflect poorly on the household. Midwives serving samurai families often had more experience and higher status. Still, medical intervention remained limited. Pain was endured quietly. Survival was hoped for, not guaranteed. Court women, particularly in imperial or noble settings, lived under the most ritualized pregnancy rules. Their lives were already governed by strict etiquette. Pregnancy added another layer of control. Movement, diet, speech, and appearance followed precise expectations. Privacy was intense. Pregnancy was often concealed behind layers of clothing and screens. Court births were highly secluded. Only select women were present. Ritual purity was emphasized strongly. The fear of spiritual imbalance was greatest here, as the stakes of lineage and succession were high. Despite comfort and resources, court women were not safer. In some cases, isolation increased risk. Across all classes, men remained distant from pregnancy and childbirth. Responsibility and endurance belonged to women regardless of status. What differed was the level of ritual, observation, and adjustment. Class changed how pregnancy was managed, not how dangerous it was. From a historical perspective, these class differences reveal a shared truth. No amount of status removed uncertainty. Rules adapted to environment, but survival depended on the same fragile balance everywhere. As this part settles into calm reflection, imagine three women living different lives carrying the same risk. Fields, halls, and palaces differ, but pregnancy moves through all of them quietly, demanding endurance above all else. Belief in fate shaped every stage of pregnancy in old Japan. Without medical explanations, people turned to ideas of destiny, balance, and unseen forces to understand why some women survived and others did not. Pregnancy was not seen as something fully controlled by human action. It unfolded within a larger order that could be guided but never commanded. Karma played a quiet but powerful role in how pregnancy outcomes were interpreted. A difficult pregnancy or loss was sometimes understood as the result of actions from a past life or from earlier choices within this life. This belief did not always bring blame. More often it brought acceptance. It allowed families to endure outcomes they could not change. Because of this belief, pregnant women were encouraged to behave with moral restraint. Kindness, calmness, and patience were thought to influence fate positively. Harsh speech, anger, or emotional excess were avoided. Pregnancy became a period of moral watchfulness as much as physical endurance. The body carried life, but the mind was believed to shape its path. The gender of the child was another source of belief and quiet speculation. While sons were often valued for lineage, daughters were not unwelcome in the same way across all regions and classes. Still, families sometimes followed small rituals believed to influence the child's gender. These practices were subtle and symbolic rather than aggressive or demanding. Superstitions guided daily behavior. Certain days were considered safer than others. Certain dreams were interpreted as signs. Animals, weather, and natural events were watched closely. These observations gave meaning to uncertainty. They helped people feel attentive rather than helpless. Names and words carried power. Some names were avoided during pregnancy. Certain phrases were not spoken. Language was believed to shape reality. Silence, once again, served as protection. Saying less meant inviting less risk. Objects also held symbolic meaning. Amulets, charms, and small ritual items were kept near the body. Their presence reassured women and families. Even when outcomes were uncertain, belief offered steadiness. From a historical perspective, these beliefs were not irrational escapes from reality. They were frameworks that allowed people to live with constant risk. Fate explained what effort could not control. Karma softened grief. Superstition gave structure to fear. As this part continues quietly, imagine a woman watching the sky at dusk, feeling the movement within her body. She does not ask for certainty. She follows rules, carries belief, and accepts what comes. Survival rests not only in the body but in meaning. By the late Edo period, pregnancy in Japan was still dangerous, still governed by belief and endurance, but it no longer existed in complete isolation from observation and record. This period did not bring modern medicine, yet it introduced a slow shift in how pregnancy was understood, remembered, and managed. Change did not arrive suddenly. It arrived quietly, layered on top of tradition. One of the most important developments of the late Edo period was the increase in written records. Village registers, household logs, and temple records began to note births, deaths, and complications more carefully. These records were not medical charts. They were administrative and spiritual documents. Yet over time, they created patterns. Communities began to notice which practices were followed by survival and which were followed by loss. Midwives also began to occupy a clearer role. While still rooted in experience rather than science, some Sanba gained reputations that extended beyond their villages. Their methods were observed, remembered, and repeated. Certain positioning techniques, post-birth care habits, and warning signs gained quiet authority. This was not formal training. It was accumulated memory becoming practice. Medical texts from China and local Japanese scholars slowly circulated during this period. These texts did not replace belief, but they added language to experience. Pregnancy was still explained through balance and energy, but there was increasing attention to the physical body itself. Bleeding, fever, and weakness were observed more carefully. Some midwives began to act earlier when danger appeared, even without understanding the cause. Dietary rules became slightly more refined. While still symbolic, some foods were favored because they were observed to support strength and recovery. Warmth remained essential. Cold remained feared. But practice began to follow observation more than pure tradition. The period after childbirth also saw subtle change. While isolation and restraint remained, some women were allowed slightly longer rest when resources permitted. This was not compassion in the modern sense. It was practical learning. Families who allowed brief recovery sometimes saw better survival. These small shifts mattered. Class continued to shape experience strongly. Samurai and merchant households were more likely to adopt new practices earlier. Peasant communities changed more slowly, bound by labor demands. Even so, knowledge traveled through marriage, markets, and midwives who moved between regions. Belief did not disappear. Fate, karma, and spiritual protection remained central. But belief now existed alongside observation. Rituals continued, but they were sometimes adjusted. Tradition stretched rather than broke. Men began to appear slightly more in record-keeping, though not in the birth space itself. Fathers and household heads noted outcomes, expenses, and losses. Pregnancy slowly became something documented rather than simply endured. This documentation changed memory. Memory changed behavior. From a historical perspective, the late Edo period represents a threshold rather than a transformation. Pregnancy was still ruled by pain and uncertainty. Women still survived through endurance. Yet the system began to learn from itself. Survival was no longer only luck and obedience, it became experience remembered. As this very long part settles into calm continuation, imagine a village where births are quietly written down, where midwives remember more than stories, where rules shift slightly but remain familiar. Tradition breathes, adjusts, and continues. With the beginning of the Meiji period in the late 19th century, pregnancy in Japan entered a new and uncertain phase. This period did not immediately replace old beliefs, nor did it erase generations of tradition. Instead, it introduced tension. Old rules remained powerful, but new ideas slowly pressed against them, changing the meaning of survival itself. The Meiji state placed strong emphasis on modernization and national strength. Women's bodies, especially as mothers, began to be discussed not only within families but also within the language of the state. Pregnancy was no longer only a private matter of fate and endurance. It became connected to population, health, and future citizens. This shift changed how pregnancy was valued, even if daily practice remained traditional. Early hospitals and clinics began to appear in cities. These spaces were unfamiliar and often distrusted. Many women avoided them unless absolutely necessary. Hospitals were associated with illness and death rather than safety. Childbirth, still seen as natural and spiritual, did not easily belong in these new institutions. Midwives continued to dominate childbirth, but their position began to change. Some were encouraged to learn new methods influenced by Western medicine. Others resisted. This created division within the profession. Experience-based knowledge faced written instruction for the first time. Authority shifted slowly, unevenly. Medical language also began to change perception. Pregnancy complications were described more clearly. Bleeding, infection, and fever were named rather than accepted silently. Naming danger altered response. Families sometimes sought help earlier. Still, access remained limited, especially outside cities. Traditional beliefs did not vanish. Rituals, amulets, and silence continued. Women still followed rules of restraint, warmth, and emotional control. However, the idea that pain must always be endured without intervention began to weaken. Endurance was still respected, but survival gained new meaning. The state promoted maternal health in abstract terms, but practical support was inconsistent. Rural women saw little change. Labor demands remained. Isolation after birth continued. The body was still expected to recover quietly. From a historical perspective, the Meiji period marks the beginning of dual systems. Old pregnancy rules coexisted with emerging medical frameworks. Women lived between tradition and change, often navigating both without clear guidance. As this part settles into calm continuation, imagine a woman hearing of hospitals for the first time, yet still trusting the hands that have guided births for generations. Change approaches slowly. Tradition does not step aside easily. Even as Japan continued to modernize, the older rules surrounding pregnancy did not disappear. Instead, they settled quietly into the foundation of modern motherhood. Many practices changed in appearance, but their underlying logic remained deeply influenced by centuries of endurance, restraint, and survival shaped in the pre-modern world. One of the strongest continuities was the expectation of emotional control. Even as hospitals became more common, Japanese motherhood continued to value calmness, patience, and quiet strength. This did not emerge from modern psychology. It reflected the older belief that emotional excess endangered both mother and child. The language changed, but the behavior remained familiar. The idea that pregnancy should be private also survived. Even in modern settings, pregnancy announcements in Japan tended to be delayed. This practice echoed older beliefs about uncertainty and risk. The habit of waiting was not medical caution alone. It was cultural memory shaped by generations who understood how fragile survival could be. Post-birth restraint also carried forward. The belief that the body needed warmth, protection, and gradual return to routine continued into the modern era. While medical explanations replaced spiritual ones, the structure remained similar. Recovery was still seen as something that unfolded slowly, not something rushed. The role of women supporting women also endured. Even as professional medicine expanded, elder women, mothers, and experienced midwives retained influence. Advice continued to pass through example and observation, not only instruction. This continuity reflects trust built long before formal systems existed. Pain, too, retained its historical meaning. While pain relief became possible, endurance remained respected. Strength was still associated with patience rather than complaint. This attitude did not reject medicine, but it shaped how women understood themselves within the experience. From a historical perspective, modern Japanese pregnancy culture cannot be separated from its past. The old rules did not vanish when hospitals arrived. They adapted. Survival no longer depended solely on endurance, but endurance remained part of identity. As this part continues quietly, imagine old beliefs settling into new structures, shaping behavior without announcing themselves. History does not disappear. It becomes habit. When historians step back and look at pregnancy in old Japan across centuries, a clear pattern begins to emerge. Practices shifted, language changed, institutions appeared, yet beneath these surface changes, the core experience remained strikingly consistent. Pregnancy continued to be shaped by rules, by pain accepted as inevitable, and by survival understood as uncertain. The rules surrounding pregnancy were never random. They formed a system designed to reduce risk in a world without control. Silence, restraint, warmth, routine, and emotional balance were not meant to comfort women. They were meant to protect life when protection was fragile. Even when medical knowledge grew, these rules did not vanish. They continued because they had worked often enough to be trusted. Pain, too, followed this pattern. In old Japan, pain was not framed as something to be eliminated. It was framed as something to be endured correctly. Endurance itself became a form of skill. Women learned how to carry pain without disrupting balance. This understanding shaped behavior long after pain relief became possible. The cultural memory of endurance remained stronger than technology. Survival was never guaranteed, and that uncertainty shaped everything. Hope was cautious. Joy was restrained. Celebration was delayed. This emotional structure protected families from devastating loss. Even in modern times, echoes of this caution remain visible in how pregnancy is discussed and managed. What changed over time was not the emotional structure, but the explanation. Fate slowly gave way to observation. Ritual was joined by record. Spiritual protection was supplemented by medical intervention. Yet none of these replaced the old system entirely. They layered on top of it. Midwives remained central long after hospitals appeared. Family support continued to matter more than institutions. Women continued to rely on other women for guidance and reassurance. This continuity shows that survival depended as much on social structure as on medical knowledge. From a historical perspective, pregnancy in old Japan cannot be reduced to suffering alone. It was a disciplined process shaped by belief, experience, and adaptation. Women were not passive victims of tradition. They navigated rules actively, adjusting, enduring, and surviving within them. As this part continues quietly, imagine centuries overlapping. Old rituals sit beside new practices. Pain remains familiar. Survival remains precious. History flows forward without breaking. When historians speak about strength in the context of pregnancy in old Japan, they do not mean heroism or endurance as celebration. Strength in this history was quiet and practical. It was the ability to continue within limits, to adapt without control, and to survive without expectation of comfort. This form of strength did not seek recognition. It existed because it had to. Women were not taught to endure pain to prove virtue. They endured because pain was unavoidable. Rules were not designed to glorify suffering. They were designed to contain risk. Over time, containment became habit, and habit became identity. Strength emerged not from choice but from repetition across generations. Importantly, this strength did not belong to individuals alone. It was communal. Women supported women through proximity, memory, and example. Knowledge passed quietly, shaped by outcomes rather than theory. Each survival added to the shared understanding. Each loss refined caution. Strength lived in this collective memory. This perspective prevents romanticization. Pregnancy in old Japan was not noble suffering. It was disciplined survival. Many women suffered deeply. Many died. The system did not protect everyone. It persisted because alternatives were absent, not because it was ideal. Understanding this helps modern audiences avoid false admiration. Respect comes not from glorifying pain, but from recognizing constraint. Women navigated a narrow path shaped by belief, labor, class, and risk. Their strength was measured by how they moved within those constraints, not by how much pain they could endure. From a historical perspective, acknowledging limits matters. Tradition offered structure, not safety. Survival improved only when observation slowly altered practice. Even then, emotional structures remained because they reduced fear, not pain. As this part settles quietly, imagine strength without applause. A woman rests, breath steady, rules followed not out of devotion, but necessity. Her strength is not a story told loudly. It is a pattern repeated, carried forward, and remembered in silence. When pregnancy in old Japan is observed across long stretches of time, it becomes clear that what sustained women was not hope of comfort, nor expectation of reward, but predictability. Rules created predictability. Predictability reduced fear. In a world where death could arrive suddenly and without explanation, predictability was its own form of safety. The rules surrounding pregnancy were repeated so often that they shaped instinct. A woman did not consciously decide to be silent, restrained, or cautious. These behaviors were learned early, long before pregnancy itself. Girls grew up watching mothers, aunts, and elder women move through pregnancy quietly. By the time their own bodies carried life, the rules already lived inside them. This internalization is one of the most important historical features of pregnancy in old Japan. Survival did not rely on constant instruction. It relied on memory embedded in daily behavior. How to sit, how to walk, how to breathe during pain, how to avoid drawing attention. These behaviors were not taught in moments of crisis. They were absorbed slowly through observation. Silence played a central role in maintaining emotional stability. Silence reduced questions. Questions created fear. Fear was believed to disturb balance. In this system, not knowing everything was safer than knowing too much. Certainty was rare. Calm acceptance was encouraged. This shaped how women experienced uncertainty internally, often carrying fear without expression. Routine anchored the body. Daily tasks continued not because pregnancy was ignored, but because routine created rhythm. Rhythm steadied the mind. Even when labor approached, familiar movements provided reassurance. This is why pregnancy was rarely separated from daily life. Separation created isolation. Continuation created grounding. Pain was interpreted through this same logic. Pain was not meaningless, but it was not analyzed deeply. Analysis led to anxiety. Anxiety led to imbalance. Pain was experienced moment by moment, not anticipated or reviewed. This present-focused endurance reduced panic, even if it increased suffering. The absence of choice is important historically. Women did not choose these rules freely, but they also did not experience them as constant oppression. The rules were shared. Everyone followed them. In that shared constraint, women found a kind of belonging. Pregnancy did not isolate them from other women's experience, it connected them to it. Loss reinforced the system. Every death strengthened belief in caution. When a woman died despite following rules, fate was blamed rather than the system. This protected the structure from collapse. The rules survived because they explained failure without demanding change. Over generations, this created a culture where pregnancy was never romanticized. It was respected, feared, and managed. There were no promises of joy, only hope of continuation. This realism shaped emotional restraint deeply. From a historical perspective, pregnancy survival in old Japan depended less on innovation and more on consistency. The system worked not because it was optimal, but because it was stable. Stability allowed communities to function even when outcomes were tragic. As this very long part continues quietly, imagine time stretching across centuries. The same movements repeated, the same silences held, the same fears carried quietly. Pregnancy passes through generations not as a story of progress, but as a pattern of endurance that slowly, almost invisibly adapts. In old Japan, most knowledge about pregnancy did not live in books. It lived in memory. It moved from woman to woman through presence, repetition, and quiet storytelling. This oral transmission was not formal teaching. It was observation layered with experience, carried across generations without written record. In a society where literacy was limited and women were often excluded from formal education, this system became essential for survival. Young girls learned about pregnancy long before it happened to them. They learned by watching. They watched how women walked when heavy with child. They noticed when women rested, when they continued working, when they became silent. These observations formed an unspoken education. By adulthood, the rules felt natural, not imposed. Stories played a careful role. Elder women did not tell dramatic birth stories. They spoke calmly, often indirectly. A story about a difficult birth was framed as a lesson about caution. A story about survival emphasized restraint and patience. Details were limited. Excess detail could cause fear. Fear was avoided. This selective storytelling shaped emotional readiness. Women learned what to expect without being overwhelmed. They learned danger existed, but they also learned survival was possible. The balance between warning and reassurance was carefully maintained. Knowledge about the body was practical rather than anatomical. Women knew what movements caused pain, what positions eased discomfort, and what signs suggested danger. They did not explain these things scientifically. They demonstrated them. Demonstration was safer than explanation. It avoided speculation. Midwives were central to this oral system. Each birth added to their internal record. They remembered patterns. They adjusted behavior slowly. Their authority came from remembered outcomes, not theory. When a midwife advised a position or action, it carried the weight of many previous births. Importantly, this oral knowledge was flexible. It adapted quietly. When a practice failed repeatedly, it was slowly abandoned. When a method seemed to help, it was repeated. This slow evolution allowed the system to survive without formal reform. From a historical perspective, this female oral tradition functioned as a hidden archive. It preserved survival strategies in a world that did not record women's experiences officially. Without it, pregnancy survival would have been far more fragile. As this part continues quietly, imagine women sitting together at dusk, not teaching directly but sharing space. A gesture, a pause, a remembered phrase carries more knowledge than any written page. History lives in these moments. Fear was a constant companion during pregnancy in old Japan. It was never denied, but it was rarely spoken aloud. Managing fear was considered essential to survival, not because fear itself caused harm, but because uncontrolled fear was believed to disturb balance. Balance in this worldview protected life. Women were not taught to eliminate fear. They were taught to contain it. Containment began with routine. Daily tasks continued not because women were ignored, but because routine anchored the mind. Familiar movements reduced space for panic. Fear was given less room to grow when the day followed a known pattern. Silence also managed fear. Speaking fear aloud was believed to give it power. Words shaped reality. By limiting speech, fear remained internal and controlled. This does not mean women felt less fear. It means fear was carried privately, shaped by discipline rather than expression. Ritual offered another form of fear management. Repetition calmed uncertainty. Wrapping the obi, touching an amulet, visiting a shrine. These actions did not remove danger, but they created a sense of order. Order reduced chaos. Chaos intensified fear. Ritual replaced uncertainty with rhythm. Belief in fate played a complex role. Accepting that some outcomes were beyond control softened fear's sharpest edge. If survival depended partly on destiny, then total responsibility did not rest on the woman alone. This belief did not remove anxiety, but it prevented constant self-blame. Community presence also mattered. Other women stayed nearby, not always speaking, but watching. This quiet supervision reassured without drawing attention. Fear was shared silently. Knowing others were alert reduced isolation. Importantly, fear was not interpreted as weakness, it was expected. What mattered was composure. Emotional restraint was not denial. It was skill. Women learned to breathe through fear as much as through pain. From a historical perspective, emotional survival was as important as physical survival. A woman overwhelmed by fear was believed to be at greater risk. Managing fear protected both body and mind within the limits of knowledge available. As this part continues quietly, imagine fear settling like mist, present but contained. A woman breathes, follows routine, touches an amulet. Fear remains, but it does not command. Survival continues within calm restraint. In old Japan, pregnancy unfolded within a different relationship to time. Time was not measured in weeks or appointments. It moved slowly, marked by seasons, routine, and bodily change rather than dates. This slow sense of time shaped how women experienced waiting, pain, and uncertainty. Silence allowed time to stretch. Without constant discussion or anticipation, pregnancy progressed quietly. Days were filled with familiar tasks, and attention stayed in the present moment. Thinking too far ahead was discouraged. The future was uncertain. Staying with the present reduced anxiety and preserved balance. Patience was not passive. It was an active discipline. Women learned to wait without expectation. Waiting did not mean hope or fear. It meant acceptance of process. This attitude helped women endure long periods of discomfort without constant emotional strain. Pregnancy rules supported this slow rhythm. Movements were careful. Changes were gradual. Nothing was rushed. Even labor, when it came, was allowed to unfold at its own pace. Interference was minimized unless danger became clear. Time itself was trusted as part of survival. Seasonal awareness also shaped experience. Women adjusted behavior according to weather and agricultural cycles. Cold seasons demanded warmth and caution. Hot seasons required rest and hydration. Pregnancy was not separate from environment. It moved within it. Silence deepened patience. Without constant reassurance or warning, women developed internal steadiness. This steadiness was not emotional numbness. It was focus. Attention narrowed to breath, movement, and immediate sensation. From a historical perspective, this slow experience of time reduced panic. Modern urgency did not exist. Pregnancy was not counted down. It was lived through. As this part continues quietly, imagine days passing gently. A woman watches light change across the room. Her body changes slowly. Time does not press. It holds. In old Japan, pregnancy rules did not survive only because they were taught. They survived because communities remembered loss together. Memory was collective. When a woman died during pregnancy or childbirth, the loss did not belong to one household alone. It settled into the shared awareness of the village, the neighborhood, or the extended family. Over time, these memories shaped behavior more strongly than instruction ever could. Loss created caution. Each death became a quiet warning. Stories were not repeated in detail, but outcomes were remembered. A woman who worked too hard, a birth that came too early, a recovery that did not last. These memories did not circulate as blame. They circulated as reminders. The rules gained strength because they were tied to remembered consequence. Community memory also created consistency. When many women followed the same rules, deviation stood out. Standing out invited concern. Concern invited correction. This social reinforcement kept practices stable across generations. Even when individuals questioned rules internally, collective memory held them in place. Shared loss also shaped emotional restraint. Public grief was limited, but communal awareness was deep. Silence did not erase memory. It preserved it. By avoiding constant discussion, communities prevented fear from spreading uncontrollably, while still honoring loss through careful behavior. Rituals surrounding pregnancy and birth reflected this shared memory. They were repeated not only out of belief, but out of remembrance. Each ritual carried the weight of previous outcomes. Following the ritual meant acknowledging those who did not survive. This collective memory allowed the system to adapt slowly. When certain practices were associated repeatedly with loss, they were adjusted quietly. No announcement was made. Change entered through subtle shifts in behavior, guided by remembered experience. From a historical perspective, pregnancy rules in old Japan were reinforced less by authority and more by shared memory. Communities learned together, mourned together, and adjusted together. Survival depended on this communal awareness. As this part continues quietly, imagine memory moving through generations without words. A pause before lifting something heavy. A reminder to rest. A shared glance. Loss speaks softly, guiding survival forward. In old Japan, pregnancy was not an isolated chapter in a woman's life. It reshaped identity long after childbirth had passed. The rules, endurance, and restraint learned during pregnancy did not disappear once a child was born. They settled into the body and mind, becoming part of how a woman moved through the rest of her life. Motherhood was not defined by affection alone. It was defined by steadiness. A woman who survived pregnancy was expected to carry forward the same discipline into child rearing, household management, and emotional life. The habits learned during pregnancy, silence, patience, caution, and emotional control, became lifelong behaviors. Endurance became identity. A woman was respected not for speaking about hardship, but for carrying it quietly. This respect was subtle. It did not come with praise. It came with trust. A woman who had endured pregnancy and birth was seen as reliable, capable of holding the household together during difficulty. Pregnancy rules trained women to manage fear internally. This skill extended into motherhood. When children became ill, when food was scarce, when loss occurred, women were expected to respond with the same calm restraint learned during pregnancy. Emotional steadiness became maternal responsibility. Pain also changed meaning. Pain was no longer something to fear, but something familiar. Women who had endured childbirth carried a different relationship to bodily discomfort. Pain did not disappear, but it lost urgency. This altered how women experienced aging, labor, and illness later in life. Social expectations reinforced this identity. A woman who complained openly or disrupted harmony risked judgment. The same rules that governed pregnancy governed adulthood. Restraint signaled maturity. Silence signaled wisdom. Endurance signaled strength. Importantly, this identity was collective. Women recognized it in one another. Shared experience created unspoken bonds. Advice was exchanged quietly. Support was offered without words. Pregnancy created membership in a lifelong community of endurance. This identity extended into old age. Elder women carried authority not because they spoke loudly, but because they had survived repeatedly. Their bodies carried memory. Their presence reassured. They became the source of guidance for younger women, completing the cycle. From a historical perspective, pregnancy rules shaped far more than birth outcomes. They shaped womanhood itself. Identity was built through repetition, not declaration. Strength was not claimed. It was assumed. As this very long part continues quietly, imagine a woman years after childbirth. Her movements are steady. Her voice is calm. The rules she followed once now guide her without thought. Pregnancy has passed, but its lessons remain, shaping a lifetime. As this long historical journey slowly comes to rest, the world of old Japan grows quiet once more. What remains is not a single story, but a pattern repeated across generations. Pregnancy, pain, and survival were never separate experiences. They were woven together through rules, silence, memory, and endurance. Women lived within structures they did not design, yet they learned how to move inside them with care. Rules were followed not because they were perfect, but because they offered predictability in an uncertain world. Pain was not celebrated, but it was understood. Survival was never promised, which is why it was valued so deeply. Across villages, towns, and households, women carried life forward quietly. Their strength was not loud, it was steady. It lived in routine, in restraint, and in shared memory passed from one generation to the next. Even as times changed, these patterns shaped identity long after pregnancy ended. History does not record every name. It does not preserve every voice. Yet it leaves traces in behavior, belief, and habit. Through these traces, we see how women endured, adapted, and survived within the limits of their world. As the night grows still, imagine these stories settling back into time. Lamps dim, voices soften, memory remains calm and unspoken. Here we let this history rest.